the Great Hearts Faculty Choir.
Let us I'll therefore take the present time, for love is crowded with the sky. Springtime, the pretty ring time. Springtime, the pretty ring time. When birds sing, ding-a-ding. Sweet lovers, sweet lovers, sweet lovers, sweet lovers, sweet lovers, love. Hey-ho, 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 hey-ho,
Welcome to the last full day of the National Symposium for Classical Education. Let's begin with a few thank yous, not the least of which is one more round of applause for our delightful faculty choir. Number two, today's keynote is sponsored by Classical Academic Press. I was tempted to read off the blurb about CAP, but it just seemed to do a little bit of injustice because CAP is not only one of the premier vendors of classical education, curriculum, books, online resources, the disputed questions, online courses, but more importantly than that, CAP is a very good friends of Great Hearts. We've had marvelous partnerships over the years, and we are just so delighted that they keep coming year after year, not just to support us, but to really join us. Chris Perrin's leadership there is tremendous. If you get a chance, please stop by the table. Jolie Hodge is here, Jesse Hake is here, and the entire team, as I said, is not only a great supporter, but a great friend of Great Hearts. So please, a round of applause for our sponsor this morning, Classical Academic Press. And then finally, Dr. Carol McNamara is going to do some thank yous later. But somebody needs to thank Dr. Carol McNamara. When Carol came in late October, about 2 weeks in, she was very fond of saying, "I'm 2 weeks on the job and about 6 months behind." And that seemed right. Carol continued that motif through about the first month, but what she doesn't know is that in about 4 weeks, she had caught up because she is that amazing. To step into an event of this magnitude in late October and to pull off what you have all experienced over the last day, the first evening, and into the day is really quite remarkable. We are so fortunate to have her leading the Great Hearts Institute and putting this symposium together this year and for the next 15? What do we talk about? Years. So please, a round of applause for Dr. Carol McNamara. There's a principle of good education that is grounded in the idea that truth is an infinite mystery. Not a mystery to be solved in the sense of, say, a murder mystery novel, but nor a mystery just to be accepted on faith. But truth, like Dostoevsky's onion, peels back one layer at a time. And because of that, this principle of good teaching says that the thing in front of you is rarely the only thing that you're teaching. So for example, in mathematics, which we all now know is Geraldine Olson's favorite subject, an algebra teacher might be teaching the slope-intercept form of a line. Now that in and of itself is beautiful, but that's not the only thing they're teaching. They're also teaching something about the relationship between equations and their shapes, and above that, between an intimate connection of algebra and geometry, and it doesn't stop there, because they're actually teaching the very nature of the discipline itself. That's true in all of the disciplines. When a middle school literature and composition teacher is having students diagram sentences, they're not only teaching the rules of grammar, but they're also teaching the orderedness of language, the beauty of language, and the very nature of language itself. And alongside of this hierarchy of what we might call the hierarchy of the discipline, alongside of this must come also a hierarchy of instruction. So that, for example, we would never start off by simply saying, here's what a direct object is, let's look at the diagram. Instead, we would put a beautiful sentence in front of the students and have them encounter it. And have them talk about the roles of the words. And from there, move on to diagramming. We would never say, this is the slope-intercept form of a line, let's practice, do a bunch of problems, and move on. We would start with the phenomenon itself and have them encounter and love that. But this hierarchy of the discipline and this hierarchy of instruction does not simply stop with the nature of the discipline itself. As my friend Mike Austin says, each one of the disciplines satisfies something unique in the human soul. Each one of the disciplines thereby is tied to virtue and human perfection. And when a teacher knows this, they are able to connect each and every daily lesson to that bold claim that we make as teachers, that our profession exists to cultivate the hearts and minds of students in virtue. And we also remember at that moment, and we realize why teaching is the noblest of professions. Because we are cultivating the souls of our young students. We are helping them to flourish. We are teaching them, even in the most basic math facts, even in the stories of history, or the paintings that we expose them to. We are teaching them what it means to live a life of virtue and a life of human flourishing. Our keynote presenter today, on the last full day of our symposium, is Dr. Jennifer Frey. Jennifer has spent many years thinking about and writing about and speaking about virtue pedagogy and the connections between virtue and knowledge in both K-12 and in higher education. Her research centers on agency and moral psychology with a focus on the nature of virtue and the nature of human flourishing. She has co-edited a book titled Self-Transcendence and is currently finishing up another volume with her husband, Dr. Christopher Frey, titled Practical Truth. Dr. Frey is the inaugural dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa and has a secondary appointment in the departments of philosophy and religion. And more importantly, is a great friend of Greatheart's. Her talk today is entitled Virtue and Liberal Learning, and so please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jennifer Frey.
Good morning. I am really thrilled and privileged to be here at the National Symposium for Classical Education, and I just want to thank my friends at Great Hearts for inviting me here to speak this morning. So I think, as everyone here more or less knows, classical educators have made great strides in recent decades in reconnecting knowledge and virtue. I send my own children to a classical school precisely because I believe that education is formation, and I want my children to be formed well, with those good habits of mind and character, those virtues, that I think will equip them, right, to pursue what is true, good, and beautiful, which is what they need in order to live a truly fulfilling, meaningful human life. However, classical education has largely been a K-12 movement in this country, which leads me to my question and my topic this morning. What about higher education? In this space, there is a reluctance to talk about character education outside of explicitly pre-professional contexts. In higher ed, there are some notable movements to connect virtue to leadership or to being a good doctor or engineer. But there really is no general vision of liberal education, sans phrase, as a kind of virtue education. There is no real movement to think about those virtues necessary for liberal learning. Some will argue that this is because character education must be a kind of indoctrination that is somehow at odds with the essence of liberal learning, which is understood in terms of a kind of unchecked freedom to find out solely for oneself what is true, good, and beautiful. I think these arguments, which I hear all the time, misunderstand the true nature of liberal learning. And I would argue that if a liberal education is what it pretends to be, what it proclaims it is, the education of a free person, then it must necessarily involve explicitly the cultivation of virtue. And this for the simple reason that there is no human freedom apart from virtue. There is no wisdom apart from it either. So the idea that universities can only focus on the intellectual virtues, as if we are brains in a vat rather than human persons, is also false. So what I want to argue this morning is that there are virtues of liberal learning, both intellectual and moral, and we can and should name them. Here are a few of them: humility, civility, fortitude, patience, docility, studiousness, integrity, honesty, and wisdom, just to start. If the studium is not regulated by these virtues, then it will not lead to human flourishing. And then the pretense that we are engaged in liberal learning and higher education is just that, it's a pretense. So I want to begin this morning by sharing the motto that is on the academic seal of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. It reads, Sapientia, Virtus, Amicitia. These are the Latin names for the three common goods at which a liberal education aims: wisdom, virtue, and friendship. Our conviction at the University of Tulsa is that the study of classic texts, which involves a very serious training in the art of dialectic, is the best path towards the promotion of these goods in a university setting. Now, in order to try to convince you of my thesis, that the study of classic texts helps those who undertake it in the right spirit and conditions to become more wise and more virtuous, and thereby capable of developing the kinds of deep and meaningful friendships that make for a happy human life, let me first just say something briefly about what I think a classic text is. A text is a classic, on my view, if we can make the case that it transcends its time and place-bound cultural markers insofar as it communicates some kind of deep truth about human life, or if it gives us access to what is beautiful and good across the ages. So a text is a classic, not necessarily because it fits into some preconceived idea of a canon that is fixed for all time, but if its value for human beings clearly endures across the generations, helping us to attain positive habits of self-transcendence. So on this view, obviously Plato's Republic is going to be a classic text within our own intellectual tradition. And of course, so is Sophocles' Antagony. But I would argue so is Flaubert's Madame Bovary, George Eliot's Middlemarch, W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and Toni Morrison's Beloved. Although all of these texts are definite products of specific time periods and cultures, they are texts that speak to us meaningfully and powerfully, just as human beings. Now, behind these claims is a basic commitment that I have about education that is not widely shared in higher ed, but I believe is shared in this room. And that is that I believe that education is formation and not simply skill or knowledge transfer. When we educate someone at any level, we are inevitably shaping their habits of being, their habits of mind, action, feeling, and desire. The only question for the educator is whether we are doing this well or poorly. We are doing it no matter what. So when we think about graduates, again, at any level, we are not simply thinking about mere possessors of knowledge and skills. They are not robots that we have programmed. We are thinking of free people that we are sending off into the world, hopefully with the idea that these people will build and sustain forms of human flourishing. No institution of education can or should be indifferent to the question of what their graduates go on to be or do. We all realize at some level that hearts and minds are being indelibly shaped both by the curriculum and the practices of our universities. I am worried that universities have put far too much stock in creating experts and high-salaried workers, and not at all enough time and attention to whether their students are equipped at graduation to live free and flourishing human lives. While expertise and work are important, they are not essential goals of the university as an institution. The university, as a place of higher education, ought to address and meet the highest aspirations of a human person. And let me be very clear. Human beings are made for much more than a life of work, and they need much more than money. If they don't have a vision of what their work is for, of what their money is for, of what their power is for, then they are not, in any interesting sense, free. Any liberal education that does not clearly perceive this is not an education we can call higher in any meaningful sense. Now, wisdom is a different habit of knowledge than expertise, and it requires a different kind of training. Now, we used to think that our universities were not first and foremost supposed to churn out experts, but the diffusion and extension of a much more universal account of knowledge. So last week I was at Harvard, and the gate that I entered campus into read at the top of it, "Enter to grow in wisdom." How quaint, I thought to myself. Almost no one at Harvard would defend this vision of education today, not even the humanists. Harvard has lost its sense of the value of wisdom. It has tripled down on disciplinary expertise as the coin of the realm. But the person who seeks wisdom strives to see how the knowledge that comes from the different disciplines can fit together into a whole, so that no part of the whole of knowledge can contradict another part of it. To seek wisdom is to strive for a sort of synoptic vision of reality. It's an end that necessarily seeks to transcend disciplinary bounds for the sake of a unified vision. Now, I think that liberal learning, or a serious training in the liberal arts, necessarily involves, in part, the study of classic texts, and it seeks a higher form of knowledge, necessarily, than expertise. This is why the liberal arts were always expansive. It was a sort of study for its own sake, which included mathematics and music in addition to the literary arts. This project of liberal learning was always centered around a love of the truth, in the deepest sense, as a desire to make contact with a reality that transcends the self and provides a measure for the mind's success or failure. But we don't get wisdom for free, and we don't get it merely by hard work studying on our own either. Wisdom is something that we can and should actively seek, at least in part, when we study those texts that set us down the path of liberal learning by asking those big, dialectical, existential questions of human life in a community of learners who seek the same common goal of universal knowledge or wisdom, and when led by a suitable guide. To do this well, we need to cultivate certain good habits of mind and character, habits that I am happy to follow tradition in calling virtues. So what virtues do we need for liberal learning? In other words, what habits of mind, feeling, and action do we need to seek wisdom as a common good in community with others? We sometimes forget that the seminar room, that the classroom is a community. First and foremost, I think we need to be thinking about docility, right? Students need to cultivate a receptivity and openness to learning from those in a position to teach them. And this means that they need to recognize the authority of their teacher, both as a kind of master of dialectic and as someone who is a suitable guide to the texts under discussion. If the student enters the seminar room with the idea that he already knows what is going on and his only job is to win the arguments of the day, this student is incapable of learning, and his progress towards wisdom is severely stunted from the start. And we cannot really understand docility apart from humility. For no one can become wise who does not recognize the need to learn from others, and I would say, most especially, the need to learn from the past. Every teacher knows the familiar challenge of the student who thinks they already have it all figured out, whose mind is rigid and flexible and unwilling to listen to the perspective of those with different experiences and backgrounds. Those students, when they participate in class discussion and conversational exchange, are operating in a competitive rather than a cooperative spirit. Their desire to show off their own excellence, to impress, is evident. They are there to dominate and to control the conversation, probably in many cases because they think this will earn them a good grade, which is the only real purpose they seem to have in that classroom. Contrast this with the person of Socrates that we are all familiar with from reading our Plato. Socrates' wisdom, he claimed, was best encapsulated in his profession of ignorance. He doesn't claim to know what he doesn't know. He never claimed to know or understand, but he was always talking about his desire for wisdom and understanding. In the Symposium, Plato introduces his readers to the idea of a ladder of love, and the idea that as we ascend the ladder, we come to see the highest object of love, which is wisdom and beauty. But what holds us back from climbing that ladder? The answer is us, We hold ourselves back with our blindness, our self-centeredness, our needy and insatiable egos. To ascend the ladder, we need a proper education, which includes intellectual friendships with those who also love truth and beauty and can help us up that ladder. But the very first step is to acknowledge the lack, right? We need to realize that we're at the bottom and we are very far from our goal. We need to see how far we have to climb and how much help and good training we need along the way. Humility, in this way, spurs on our desire to know, right? We know that we need to make an effort to get there. Now, Plato and the subsequent tradition, which we call the perennial philosophy, also recognize that the love of knowledge can become profoundly disfigured or disordered. He saw quite plainly that we might orient our study not towards the possession of the highest good, not wisdom, but power, honor, or to satisfy our lust or jealousy. We might want to know things that we should not know, right? You can think of Leonidas in the Republic, who cannot help himself from looking at all those dead bodies with morbid curiosity. Or you might think of Alypius in the Confessions, who succumbs to the lust of the eyes that are satisfied only by the murderous spectacle of the gladiatorial games. We cannot be wise, Plato argued, unless we love rightly. And that is because wisdom is an arduous goal that does not come easily and that we cannot get on our own. It comes through contemplative study and dialectical conversation with other people. Plato displays this dialectical exchange in the speeches that comprise the symposium, which culminates in the famous speech of Diotima, who symbolizes wisdom. Socrates, of course, merely reports this speech, but he does not profess to understand it completely. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas will later call the virtue that regulates our appetite for knowledge studiositas. Aquinas places the virtue of studiositas as a potential part of the cardinal virtue of temperance, because he recognizes that the cultivation of this virtue requires the moderation of an appetite. It's not an intellectual virtue. The same is true of humility, by the way, for St. Thomas. Aquinas sees that here we are speaking about a training in our loves and our pleasures. All forms of temperance involve this. But the appetite in question is both our natural desire to know and our appetite to achieve great things, both of which need moderation and direction towards their proper objects. When we recognize these moral virtues as necessary for good study, we reaffirm the traditional view that contemplation is not neutral looking. It is guided by what we love. So those who claim that the university can only focus on contemplative habits of mind have forgotten what the tradition has long taught us about the nature of contemplation. It is always a reflection of what we desire. I further want to emphasize humility in relation to the study of history and historical texts. In many students today, I perceive not only an alarming ignorance of the past, but a prideful attitude that assumes they have no need to learn it, except insofar as it helps them think more highly of themselves and our present age. The assumption is that we, the current generation, are more enlightened, whereas previous generations were simply ignorant, backward, oppressive, and evil. There is very little recognition in many students that in 100 years or less, young people may be saying the same things about their lives on grounds that we cannot even really imagine, or that today's heroes, the people they deeply admire, might be their great-grandchildren's miscreants and malfeasance. But a healthy and correct engagement with the past does cultivate the virtue of humility. It is necessary to pierce through the veil of self-deception that makes young people be uncritical of the present, which is something they have simply inherited and whose foundations they cannot understand except through patient study. For those of us who have bothered to immerse ourselves in history, we see quite clearly that the great leaders of past civilizations are all pretty much a mixed bag. Like ourselves, they have their virtues and their vices, their strengths and their weaknesses, their heights of vision and their somewhat ridiculous blind spots. And students need to learn to sift the past for both its wisdom and its wickedness. This is not simply the task of historical experts. This is the task of human civilization, and thus it's the task of all of us. To the extent that we have abnegated this task, we have denied ourselves a part of our own humanity. For we humans are very unlike other animals, and that we are creatures who are situated in history. We do not simply live in the here and now. We have the capacity for a broader, deeper, more capacious and expansive human vision, one that takes in what came before us and looks towards an imaginative future that is better. But we can lose this aspect of our humanity if we do not actively cultivate it. And this, of course, is precisely the work of education. Fortitude, or courage, is necessary to pursue wisdom. But this is not only a matter of thinking correctly, but of having the strength of spirit to suffer for what one believes is true and good. We need the courage to speak the truth, even when this is unpopular, or we worry a great deal that we might offend someone by what we say. Plato, of course, argued that we must be willing to speak the truth even to the point of death, and here again, Socrates was his model. Socrates was killed by the Athenian society he so dearly loved on charges of atheism and corrupting the youth. And rather than make a deal or compromise with his accusers, Socrates, being himself, engages his accusers in dialectics to show them what they really condemn is the examined life, the sort of life he puts forward as the truly flourishing one. In being willing to die for what he believed was the highest good, Socrates, of course, becomes a martyr for philosophy, for the sort of life committed to the pursuit of wisdom above all else. Now, his example forces us to ask ourselves a difficult but important question. What am I willing to die for? Do I value anything more than myself, such that a sacrifice such as this even makes sense to me? It is a question worth asking ourselves and our students. It reminds them that when we attempt to speak the truth, we put ourselves at risk. It helps to clarify for them what their ultimate values are. It also makes clear that we need to develop the fortitude to face the consequences of speaking our minds. People may attack us. They may misunderstand or twist our words in bad faith. They may successfully refute us, thereby wounding our pride. But our fortitude must coincide with civility. In the seminar, I can guarantee you, sometimes quite vociferously. We have all seen this play out, and we know that conversations can become heated and uncomfortable as students feel that their identities and allegiances are being called into question, because they are. They begin to feel existentially threatened. This is why we must cultivate civility in the classroom. Civility is born from the recognition that your conversation partner is worthy of dignity and respect and must be treated accordingly. Robust disagreement is an essential part of liberal learning, but the discourse must be civil. We attack ideas, not people. We engage in a manner that is respectful of all participants in the conversation, who all equally have a stake and a say in that conversation. We object, but not in ways that are demeaning, degrading, or otherwise disrespect their worth as equal participants in the exchange. So I've been dwelling on the connection between virtues and liberal learning. The way to bring these together in the study of classic texts, I think, surely, and higher education is through the art of dialectic. So I want to say a little bit about what I think that art is. First of all, what's a dialectical question? A dialectical question does not admit of a straightforward answer. If I ask you what time it is, there's just an answer to this question. And you will either give me the correct answer or you will be wrong. A dialectical question is not like this at all. A dialectical question is the sort of question that leaves one free to take either side of a manifest contradiction. If I ask you whether time is linear, I am asking you a dialectical question. The answer, if given, will need to take very seriously arguments for the opposite answer in order to be remotely convincing. Now, classic texts are very good at raising dialectical questions, these kinds of big existential questions that lie at the heart of human existence and that do not admit of obvious answers, and thus call us to examine arguments for both sides and to dispute with one another over any potential answer we give. In liberal learning, through the study of classic texts, we grow in this art of dialectic, this kind of giving and taking of reasons for our positions, reasons which have been informed by our inherited intellectual tradition, right, that gives us a range of quite interesting possible answers. To learn and grow in this art, we need more than logic and rhetoric. We need to study the arguments that have moved people in the past and assess them in light of what we think we know today. To study classic texts is to enter a conversation with the great thinkers of the past, but to do it together with others who are trying to learn to make their own arguments alongside us. And if we share wisdom as a common end and good, then we will want to help one another along the way. We will want to dispute, to exchange ideas, to propose amendments, and to help one another read and understand the text in question. A true liberal learner is someone who enjoys the art of serious conversation and cannot imagine getting on in life without it. Such a person will seek out such conversations, not just in the classroom, but throughout his or her life, right? And they will seek them out because they enjoy them. I suspect that this audience is filled with people who understand exactly what I'm talking about. And this brings me back around to the final aim on the motto of our Honors College, and that is friendship. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does liberal learning and the study of classic texts have to do with the cultivation of friendship? And the answer lies, I think, in the fact that a college, a collegium, is a community of learners that aim at a common good. And it's the nature of a common good that it cannot be had alone. So I just really want to briefly unpack this. If you think about a common good, it's common in three senses. It belongs to human nature to desire such a good. It's not competitive. My pursuit of it in no way detracts or impedes your pursuit of it. And it's participatory, right? So the creation and enjoyment of the good only comes about through those common activities in which others participate. I think that wisdom, virtue, and friendships are each common goods in this sense. We do not get or sustain them on our own. They cannot be parceled out to individuals. If someone is even moderately wise, it's only because other people have helped him to get into that condition. Obviously, I can read classic texts on my own and profit from this enormously, but this alone will not help me grow very far in wisdom. I need to engage in that sort of dialectical inquiry that only comes about when I advance a thesis and subject it to the back and forth of dialectical exchange with others. It is in that back and forth that we grow in wisdom and self-knowledge. When others help us understand who and what we are through conversations about dialectical questions that is disciplined, rigorous, and ultimately generative. But in the best form of dialectical exchange, participants are not out to beat one another. It should not be entered into for the sake of domination or control, but for the sake of helping the other person reach the common good shared between the participants. If I enter into dialectical exchange with true wisdom in mind, then I know it is not something for me alone to possess. If friendship is the reciprocal goodwill between persons who share common ends and actions, then the basis of the goodwill and mutual affection in a community of liberal learners is our shared love of wisdom. Our intellectual exchanges would be fruitfully grounded in this common purpose, which we recognize can only be sought and sustained together. And this has to be taught. I think our contemporary culture is full of debate to the detriment of dialectic, of people who enter into conversation to win or defeat their interlocutor in order to satisfy their own personal ambitions or sense of self, rather than to enter the conversation with an openness to learning from the perspective of another and a spirit of seeking the truth together. We use conversation now to advance ourselves and our agendas, to grow our brand, rather than to grow in self-knowledge, because we are no longer open to the idea that other people are the best sources of knowledge about ourselves. This is a shame, but again, I think the study of classical texts in the context of liberal learning can help us. Everyone in this room has probably read St. Augustine's Confessions, and so you know that he came to understand his own classical education as a failure, precisely because it did not train his desire to know to seek the highest good. It had been trained to satisfy his own vanity and social ambition. It fed what he aptly called the libido dominandi, that primitive lust for domination that he later came to associate with original sin. So I've been arguing that our universities ought to be the institutions uniquely dedicated to this sort of dialectical exchange, to modeling it, promoting it, and helping it to flourish well beyond its own corridors and towers. If they were, I believe that we would, in fact, see intellectual friendships flourishing in our seminars and in our universities across political and cultural divides. The fact that we are not seeing this today, and in fact are seeing increasing division and self-censorship, is profoundly related to the eclipse of liberal learning on our campuses. So, I hope that I have at least opened up the possibility that liberal learning requires certain virtues. I have discussed some of them by naming them and saying why I think they are essential to liberal learning. But of course, the question of how we cultivate them within the seminar and within our student programming remains unaddressed. But we have to start somewhere. Thank you so much for your attention.
So as before, we will engage in some Q&A with Dr. Frey. The microphone is up front, and please feel free to come and get in line and ask a question. I will kick us off here. I am curious, as somebody who has children, who's taught children of various ages, who've gone to college, So has experienced just a wide variety, of course, as all of us have, of levels of education. If anywhere in your thought or research or writings, if you've thought about whether certain virtues are easier to cultivate at certain ages.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that it's hard to cultivate wisdom in a 5-year-old. They just don't have the perspective taking and the deliberative capacities. Their horizons are quite narrow. So there are things that are kind of more fundamental and we need to build. I think that docility is something that you can start to teach young children. And in fact, it's probably easier for them than it is for students in higher education who maybe think that they have it all figured out. And I will say, I think this, this extends into the classical space. So obviously I go to a lot of classical schools and I talk to them about the honors college and what we're reading. And I often hear the same thing, which is, well, I've already read that. I read Homer in the 6th grade. And I say, that is amazing. I can promise you that it's different when you're 18. It's different when you're 30. It's different when you're 45. And it's a book that demands that you return to it again and again and again. And so I think that it's really not so much about what virtues you teach when, but how you are cultivating them in your students. In higher education, you can't be sort of explicitly didactic. One, your students aren't going to respond to it. But two, it's not really appropriate anymore, right? We really are trying to give them this kind of freedom to explore ideas, to test things out. But when we think about, and this is why I really want to tie it to the art of dialectic. It's like, what are those virtues that govern dialectical exchange? Because that's really the work that they're engaged in. And it turns out that those are kind of the same. They're the same virtues, but in a different context. And I think that the way that it comes out is in the doing of it, right? You sort of have to model, you have to critique, you have to show them, right, the right way to go. And I think they get it, right? And I think that they're appreciative of that, because at the end of the day, they are trying to become better thinkers, better speakers, better writers. They all want this, right? They just need help in getting there in the seminar space.
That's great. We'll go to the audience.
Thank you. Wonderful remarks, by the way. My name is Bob Schaefer. I'm from Fort Collins, Colorado. So my question to you is, I'm fascinated by the emphasis on friendship, and it strikes me as just wonderful, especially with what we confront out there today, just anti-intellectual celebration, what some might call anti-civilization that just exists on college campuses and in our schools as well, I suppose, to some extent. And friendship is a wonderful remedy to focus on it. Here's my question. I want to know, one, if you agree with I think St. Thomas subsumes friendship in the cardinal virtue of justice. It is the virtue that is about exchange and sharing, mutual affection, as you said, and so on. So I want to ask you kind of an impossible question, too. One, do you agree that friendship is a part of justice more than the other three? Mm-hmm. And then secondly, given that, if that's true, which is more important? And especially for the students, most of us are involved in teaching with the limited time we have. Should we, or is there an age-appropriate level?
Yeah, so, Aristotle makes a very interesting remark. He says, the just need friends, but friends don't need justice. Now, is he saying that friends can steal from one another and lie to one another? No, he's not saying that. But I think he is suggesting that a couple of things. One, I think ultimately Aristotle is suggesting that friendship is just the context of virtue, simpliciter, right? It is exercised and cultivated between friends. But I think he's also recognizing that love is something higher, and friendship is ultimately about love. And of course, it's related to justice insofar as it's relational. It involves our transaction with others, right? And so it is possible to wrong someone. But I think he's sort of picking up on the fact that if you love someone, you'll just have no desire to wrong them.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
That was a great talk. Thanks very much. I want to invite you to say something more about friendship, and I appreciate the reference to Aristotle. And I was thinking about the way in which he calls friendship a virtue, or in a way, virtue simpliciter. You identified friendship as a common good, and I think rightly do so. It also seems to me the grounds for the kind of dialectical exchange that students have with each other and that the teacher has with the students. And I'm wondering about the extent to which you think friendship is a requisite of genuine dialectic. So both an end but also a means of the kind of environment that is necessary for liberal learning.
Yeah, what a great question. I'm probably, well, I don't know, I'll say some things and then I might take them back. But let me just say that it's not necessary in the sense that you can obviously do dialectical exchange without it. But I do think the ideal case is one in which there is a sort of low-level friendship, right? I mean, we have a different conception of friendship than Aristotle did, and certainly our students do. I think I'm not saying that our modern conception is better. I'm almost never saying that, but I'm just recognizing the reality. And I think what's really important for me as someone who leads a college and is therefore tasked with sort of modeling what I think we should be doing for our students, I think for me, it's important that they understand that we are not competing against one another, because they all come in with this idea that they just have to win it, right? That's what honors is. Like, I won an honor and I beat someone. So you really have to work hard to get them out of that mindset. And then I think in a related way, you also have to get them out of this kind of instrumentalized mindset that their education is for the sake of almost anything else, right? Other than what it's actually about. And so you really have to work with them together, right? And you sort of cultivating relationships between the professors and the students, but also between the students themselves. And so there's a lot of work that we do outside the classroom to cultivate that sense of community, that sense of belonging. That's what they really need. And this is borne out by all kinds of empirical evidence that the number one indicator of success in a school is whether or not you feel that you belong. And that's the kind of low-level friendship that I think probably is necessary. And for me, what I try to get them to focus on is that we are trying to grow in self-knowledge, right? And we cannot do this on our own. We are trying to better understand who we are and what's going on and where we're going, and get them to buy into that concept. And a lot of that work has to happen outside the seminar. It has to be reinforced outside the seminar, but it really bears its fruits in the seminar.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can we talk a little bit more about the great books? You alluded to this in your first answer. I think everybody in the room would agree that the great books are worth reading and rereading.
Yes.
But there is, I think, at least in some places, and maybe in the honors college is one of these, there's a sea change. I believe the only book that I read in college that I had read also in high school was Beowulf. So most of my exposure to the great books was only in college. But we're here at a classical education
Yes.
conference, and so all of these schools are having students read these books in high school.
Yes.
How do you see that difference in students who have already read it in high school? How do you see that difference of when they encounter them again? How does that change the way, as a teacher, you think about presenting these books?
Yeah, so my context is interesting because I am getting some classically educated students, but I'm also just getting very normie mainstream students, and they're all in the classroom together. And I'm also getting students from like a really wide variety of experience and conviction. So our seminars can get very interesting and very spicy, like very quickly. And I love that. I have to say that it's that kind of tension that I think is really super productive. It makes for the best sorts of conversations. I think for the classically educated students, they're more prepared, right? I mean, they just are not going to struggle with Homer in the way that another student might. Nevertheless, they are still really challenged, but for them the challenge is different, right? It's not the struggle to have any idea of why reading Homer is important. That's not a problem with them. But they are perhaps not used to talking to people who really, frankly, have very little in common with them and that do not share their priors. And that is a challenge that I think is very good for these students, and we try to, help them navigate that. So in some ways, they are far better prepared, and I think in some ways, they might initially struggle.
Good. I'm going to try to get through the four that are in line here. Dr. Roper.
So thank you for the talk. I wanted to offer first just a little phrase I learned from Alan Howard in graduate school, who learned it from the great Americanist Perry Miller, that I always use in my classes. And he used to say, "Let us be brutal, for we love one another."
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Yeah.
And I think it works so well in that sense of dialectic. But what I wanted to ask is, a year and a half ago, I descended from Parnassus to the Agora. After almost 30 years of being an English professor at a Chaucerian, I took on the role of Dean of Students.
Yeah.
And we have this amazing core curriculum. I think we have an amazing culture of dialectic and of friendship, of intellectual friendship at the University of Dallas. But then there's what happens on Friday nights. And I'd sort of love to hear you, if you could, descend from Parnassus and talk a little bit about how do we take, even when the students have these really astonishing senses of the intellectual virtues, and how do we begin to drive them down into their lives, into the dust where I live?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, it's about connecting the curriculum to the student life experience. So if you're in the world of higher ed, then you know that student experience is something that academic administrators have nothing to do with. It's just its own world. It's over there. Who knows what's happening? I am different from all the other deans in my university, and I'm different from most deans in that my college is residential. They live together in a dorm, and so they are this kind of living, learning community. And therefore, for me, bringing the residential life experience, the student life experience, back into the curriculum is really important. And so we've looked at a couple of truly excellent models for how to do this, one being our good friends at Baylor. Baylor does a really good job with their residential life and kind of taking charge of that. And so we're trying to build that at the University of Tulsa. However, I will say, this is one of those differences in higher ed. These are adults, and what they do on a Friday night is none of my business. And, I have to give them that freedom. However, at the same time, I do recognize that there needs to be a unique student life associated with honors. And we do tell our students, you know, every one of you, whether you like it or not, you're an ambassador for this college, right? So the way that you go out and behave on campus does reflect us. And we sort of let them sit with that.
But could I challenge that just for a minute? I think it is our business. I think that their learning to move from license to liberty actually is our business. And that maybe we need to call them out. And,
Yeah, I
and that's
mean-
what we've begun to do, is to form a real community based on, you know, as persons together, not individuals, but as persons
Yeah.
together, how do we lead one another?
Yeah, I mean,
and
it
to-
may be
and to
it may
claim
be
that.
that at certain schools, you know, there is a kind of mission around that, and I have no problem with that. But it would not work at my school. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. When you're speaking about dialectical discussion and then, say, for instance, Harvard's abandonment of that in many ways, I look at examples like of professors like Martin Kulldorff, Jay Bhattacharya, Jordan Peterson, Roland Fryer. I think if these guys are being destroyed by the administration and their fellow faculty, independent students who are independent thinkers don't stand a chance. So how do you help, if you step back into the role of, say, a high school guidance counselor, how would you help students identify universities, colleges to go to where independent thinking and dialectical discussion are encouraged?
Yeah, what a great question. So I think that you need to look at several different metrics. You know, FIRE has a free speech guide. It's somewhat controversial. It's imperfect, but it also picks out some things that are worth noticing. It should surprise no one that Harvard is almost at the bottom, precisely because there is a kind of active suppression of wrongthink at Harvard. We can point to particular cases, including the persecution of friends of mine who are wonderful scholars, but who happen to have the wrong ideas about some things. You know, parents and students need to pay attention to that. Because it says something about the values and the culture of those institutions. I think that another thing that parents and students need to be doing is talking to the students at that institution. So I always encourage, parents and students to actually get to know the students, and because that's where the answer is, right? As dean, right, I'm going to always put the best face in front of for my college, right? But what I really want you to do is talk to our students. I think our students are our best ambassadors. I always try to bring honors college students to all of our events, and I just say, hey, talk to them. They know what it's actually like, and I do not coach them about what to say because I want them to be honest, in part because if something's going wrong, you know, I want to hear about it as well. I think that, you know, you really need to consider levels of self-censorship on campus. You need to consider cases of suppression of speech, and you need to ask difficult questions when you're on a campus visit about what the culture there is really like.
Thank you, Professor. I find myself surprised and delighted by the idea of studiousness as a sub-virtue of temperance.
Yeah.
In my first grade classroom, the definition for studiousness that we use is seeking to grow closer to the truth. So I have two questions for you. One is, do you have any insights about that definition? And then the second is, are there other virtues that you have studied that have that sort of surprising quality like studiousness that's I thought of as an intellectual virtue, and yet here
Yeah.
it is as temperance.
Yeah, so there's a really just extraordinary essay by someone named Gregory Reichenbach, just called Studiositas. I think it's like 8 pages long. And I wish I could give it to everyone. Such a great little essay. You know, I mentioned St. Thomas in connection to Studiositas, but it's right there in Plato, right? This idea of intellectual temperance is right there in Plato, and it's always been a part of our tradition. I think it does surprise people when I say, hey, that's a moral virtue. It regulates an appetite, right? It regulates a desire. And in fact, it regulates like the fundamental desire of the studium, our desire to know. And so the definition that you gave hits on that, right? Seeking, what was it? Seeking to know the truth or something like that?
Seeking to grow in truth. Grow closer to the truth.
Yeah, so that seeking, that is that sense of desire, right? That wanting. And I think the reason that I am quite literally obsessed with Studiositas is I think that careful study of that virtue just shows, at the level of moral psychology, at the level of the human person, just how inextricably tied the life of the mind is to the life of desire and feeling and passion. And I just don't think we do ourselves or our students any good when we try to separate them, right? They're a human person. What we study is directed by what we love. And I think that if we take that seriously, our conception of the virtues starts to change and become more integrated and unified. And there are all sorts of surprises that come out of that.
Dr. Mulholland.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to share a text and ask a question.
Okay.
This is a text that's really jumped out at me this year in our great book seminar. It is from Amy Bennett's recent translation of Xenophon's Memorabilia, Book 1, Chapter 6, 14, if you're taking score. He's reporting a conversation between Socrates and Antiphon. Accordingly, Antiphon, just as another is pleased by a good horse or a dog or a bird, so I myself am even more pleased by good friends. And if I possess something good, I teach it, and I introduce them to others from whom I believe they will receive some benefit with a view to virtue. And reading collectively with my friends, I go through the treasures of the wise men of old, which they wrote and left behind in their books. And if we see something good, we pick it out, and we hold that it is a great gain if we become friends with one another. And then Xenophon says, when I heard these things, I formed the opinion that he himself was blessed and that he led those who heard him to nobility and goodness. Now, I'm right now trying to gain weight to tattoo that text on my back in Garamond 12 font. But my question is, do you think that your motto, Sapientia Virtus Amicitia, is a rhetorical ascending tricolon?
What a great question. I mean, I see them all as essentially bound up with one another, right? So that's for sure. I don't think you can get one of those without the others. So does that make it a yes in your mind?
Well, is one higher than the other? Because there's true knowledge, and then there's good action.
I suppose
and then there's living that in community.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I think that wisdom, right, would be the highest there. Yes, I think that because especially in a university, but I might even go more broadly, you know, and speaking in a Christian context, right, the goal is to fulfill that desire for knowledge, ultimately with knowledge of the highest object, which is God. Yeah, so I'd probably put wisdom at the top.
We'll do one more question.
Thank you. So in your description of what dialectic is, you've spoken rather pejoratively of pride, of competition, maybe even of spiritedness. But these are all qualities that we associate with young people, and dare I say, especially young men. So how do you get young students, especially young spirited men, to engage in your vision of dialectic?
Yes, well, I don't really claim that it's my vision of dialectic. I think it's kind of the traditional account. So it comes from men, but I just sort of think it's not really gendered in any especially interesting way, and I think that, you know, the men that I encounter are all like pretty different. I mean, I would be really hard pressed to say, you know, the men in my honors college are like this. Some of them are like this and some of them are like that. And the same is true of the women. And I think that really what we're working on is, I mean, pride is just an excessive desire, you know, to prove your own excellence or something like this, and a disordered perception of your own excellence. And that, I don't think it's a uniquely male problem. I just think it's a human problem. And I think, you know, a lot of our seminars these days, a lot of our colleges these days have a kind of gender imbalance. You'll typically find more women than men in the college classroom these days, which is interesting and I think not good. I don't have a solution to that, in case anyone was thinking that I did. But I just think, I honestly think that in the seminar, when you have about 13 to 15 people, it ends up being a very individual thing, how you draw them in and how you work with them, because they all just kind of have different challenges. Yeah.
Do you think there's a question of ends here? So it does strike me that it's true that if our end is truth, right, pride and competition can get in the way, right?
Yeah.
So that seems right to me. But is there a place, for example, where competitiveness can itself be a virtue, say, for example, on the athletic field?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm not saying competition is like bad in itself. But I do think that in the seminar space and when it comes to dialectical exchange, it's really not best engaged in a competitive spirit precisely because it's ordered to a common good, right? You're like misunderstanding the thing you're engaged in. You know, the medal is not a common good. If I get it, you don't.
Right.
Right? So, and you know, some academic honors are like that as well. If I get the Rhodes Scholarship, like you don't, you know, so there's still room for competition. It's just that what I find with students, and this was something that was true of myself when I was 18, entering into the study of philosophy for the first time, is that I was only really ever trained to see academics as like a competitive thing, and I was good at it, like I had done pretty well, but it was all about ranking and all of this stuff, and I just sort of had this realization, which, you know, just changed my life as a young person, that you know, this isn't it. This is not what it's about.
I said one more, but I did check my clock, and I think we can, in fact, do one more.
Well, I knew you said no more, but we just want the author of the essay that you said on studiousness.
Oh, it's Gregory Reichenberg. So I will. Gosh, can I spell it? It's Reichen. I think it's ERG. But if it's URG, don't get mad at me. But I think it's ERG. Yeah, and if anybody if you email me, I'll just send it to you. It's a beautiful essay.
Well, Dr. Frey, thank you so much. What a great way to kick off our day here. We have lots of breakouts, another keynotes coming up today. It's proving to be just a marvelous day as yesterday was, and thank you for kicking us off.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Hello, everyone. Before you get ready to sort of organize yourselves for the day, I have some announcements, lots of information. First of all, we have the same schedule today as we did yesterday. There will be 2 breakout sessions during the next 2 hours or so.